A wide grinning maw stretching from one side of its horrible body to the other, and above it a giant eye that beholds all. On slimy, writhing stalks sit 10 more eyes, never closing, each capable of unleashing debilitating and devastating magic on any foe who is unfortunate to cross paths with this abomination of nature. We are, of course, talking about the Beholder, one of, if not the most iconic monster in all of Dungeons & Dragons, and it is even on the cover of the 5th edition Monster Manual. Ahoy everyone, I'm Nazir North and welcome to the channel. In this video we are going to break down one of the most interesting and one of my favourite monsters in Dungeons & Dragons, the Beholder. To non-D&D players it is still recognisable as a horrible many-eyed monster, but to those familiar with D&D, the possibility of encountering a Beholder on the battlefield is a terrifying prospect, whether due to its infamous anti-magic cone or its various powerful eye rays, including some rays that can insta-kill player characters on the spot. Beholders are notoriously lethal. In this video we're going to look at abilities, behaviour and battle tactics for Beholders to help you work out how you can include them in your campaign as a Dungeon Master and how you can run them effectively in combat. There is a lot to discuss on this one, so let's jump straight in. We'll start with some lore and background on the Beholders. There are actually two sources I'll be referring to in this video. There's the Beholder entry in the 5th edition Monster Manual, along with Volo's Guide to Monsters, which has another 12 pages all dedicated to Beholders. Much like the Aboleth that we looked at in a previous video, the Beholder is inspired by the Eldritch horrors from American author H.P. Lovecraft. It is designed to be strange, alien and otherworldly, and its biology defies logic. In terms of its physical form, Beholders are large and they hover around. They have a face of sorts with a huge mouth and one big central eye. They then have 10 tentacle-like stalks, each of which has another eye on the end. The Monster Manual entry tells us that Beholders do sleep, but while they do so they keep their smaller eyes wide open, always watching in every direction for possible threats. Beholders can also sleep while hovering in the air, so they don't ever need to touch the ground. Mechanically, this means Beholders are going to be next to impossible to sneak up on. There is a lot of variation in the specifics of how a Beholder can look, from the type of skin or scales it has, to its coloration and the style of its eye stalks. We'll get into more detail on individual Beholder characteristics and customization later on, but the key point here is that it's very rare for two Beholders to look alike. Almost everyone is unique. Beholders do eat to sustain themselves, but they don't appear to be picky. They view pretty much any other creature that they consider to be inferior to them, which is pretty much everything, as either a pet, food, or a potential minion to force into their service. Okay, so we know what Beholders look like, but where do they come from? They are described as being alien-like, but are they actually from another world? Beholders know the language of deep speech, which is the language of the far realm, a Lovecraftian plane of strangeness and madness on the very edge of existence. So yes, this is where Beholders originally come from, but they are able to reproduce. So many Beholders encountered could actually be native to the plane that the adventurers find them on, although they aren't exactly born in the traditional sense. A Beholder's mind is said to be so powerful that it can warp reality nearby. One of the regional effects given to it in the Monster Manual says as much. And when a Beholder dreams, that's when things get really weird. Specifically when Beholders dream of other Beholders. They may either create a duplicate of themselves, another form of lesser Beholder kin, like say a spectator, or a new and unique Beholder form. In some instances, these new creations may work together with their Beholder parent, but you can also imagine scenarios where they are immediately hostile to one another. It's not completely clear from the two sources whether beholders can intentionally choose to have such dreams and create new beholders, or whether it's purely accidental. I think you could create some interesting stories and plot arcs around this process either way though. On its psychological nature and behaviour, there is a lot to be said about beholders. They are greedy, hateful, narcissistic and aggressive. They are also fairly mentally unstable, making them appear unpredictable and manic at times. Although, of course, from the beholder's own perspective, every action they take is meticulously calculated and reasoned, with all possible outcomes planned for and anticipated, and strategies and counter-strategies all prepared within its own mind. Beholders are known as creatures that overthink everything. Beholders are xenophobic and they suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. Each individual beholder believes it is the perfect expression of life. It thinks it is the greatest being there is. It tends to think that others around it are envious of it and are always plotting to destroy it. And it sees other creatures as lesser beings, looking down on them like simple animals. Interestingly, this applies to other beholders as well. The general rule is that all beholders will hate one another, as they all individually think they are the best beholder. Following on from this, as beholders think they are perfect, they probably don't think they can be bested in combat. They may not believe they can be defeated. This could mean that they are very unlikely to retreat from battles, as they may believe they are stronger than their opponents and can overcome them. Right up until the moment of their demise, defeat may seem like an impossibility from their perspective. But that being said, you could play this both ways. Beholders are, at the end of the day, intelligent creatures, so they may consider a tactical retreat a viable strategy. That's going to be up to you as the Dungeon Master. As antagonists and big bad guys for a villain arc in your campaign, beholders will generally fall into one of three categories. The first, your classic beholders, are the isolationists, who live far away from society, probably in the middle of some deadly lair of their own creation. Isolationist beholders may have minions and followers, but they prefer to spend most of their time alone, and far away from major population centres. The next type are eye tyrants. These are beholders who have established themselves as masters over other creatures, maybe as the puppet master pulling the strings of the local king or queen, or maybe as the secret leader of a nefarious guild, such as the Xanathar Guild in the Forgotten Realms setting. And the last and rarest type are hive beholders. These occur when a beholder dreams and creates one or more beholders identical to itself but smaller in size. As these beholders all share the same personality and appearance, they tend to work together as one unit. While they don't have a true hive mind, they are so alike in the way they think that they're able to predict each other's behaviour and work together in a way that few other creatures can. These hives usually consist of around 3 to 10 beholders, plus any other minions in their service. Alright, let's talk about the beholder's lair. A beholder's lair is particularly deadly even when compared to the lairs of other powerful legendary creatures like dragons. This is because a beholder can use its disintegration ray to meticulously carve out passages exactly as it desires, often forming complex vertical tunnels which cannot be easily traversed by non-flying creatures. Because beholders handcraft, or rather eye-craft, their lairs to be almost impossible to navigate for anyone but themselves, they really are a death trap to the unprepared. Beholders are very intelligent, and they've probably dealt with a few adventuring parties in the past, so they will likely be prepared for all sorts of tricks that interlopers might try and pull. With their rampant paranoia, they may also expect people to come to try and kill them, so they will always be anticipating hostile action, and will have plans on top of plans to counter any strategy that the player characters might attempt. If a beholder has scouts or spies in the surrounding area, they may already know about the combat capabilities of the party, and may have designed specific traps and encounters to combat and counter the party's strengths. Linking back to the Beholder's other behaviours and psychological qualities, they are greedy and proud, so Beholder lairs will often display trophies and other treasures they've collected. That may include the statues of petrified foes, or maybe even prisoners it has kept alive for its own amusement. Beholders are also known to crave knowledge, so stolen old tomes, spell scrolls and ancient books may feature amongst the Beholder's amassed treasure hoard. In terms of lair layout, Beholders will have galleries and prisons to show off their prized collections, as well as areas for their minions to live in. If they have minions that can only walk, for example, certain sections of the lair will probably be made to accommodate this, while certain other sections may only be accessible by flying or climbing. Within each lair, a Beholder may have a specific resting or viewing chamber which is only accessible to them, either via flying or accessible using their anti-magic cone. For example, the chamber may be protected by a permanent wall of force or wall of fire that is temporarily broken by the Beholder's anti-magic cone, creating a curtain almost for them to pass through. And it almost goes without saying that the Beholder's lair will be filled to the brim with complex and intricate traps, many of which the Beholder may have personally designed and set up themselves using their telekinesis. Okay, let's have a run through the Beholder stat block, and it is a big one, so let's break it down into sections. The Beholder is a large-sized aberration, and its given alignment is lawful evil. It's got a surprisingly high armor class of 18 and an average of 180 hit points. It can't walk, but it has a hover speed of 20 feet. So far we can see it's pretty tanky but relatively slow, even though it's got a flying speed for mobility. It's got good mental ability scores with charisma and intelligence both being high at 17. It's also got a very good constitution score at 18. It has proficiency with all mental saves too, so it's going to be pretty good at resisting most spell effects. It's proficient with perception, as you might expect for a creature with 11 total eyes, bringing its passive perception to an incredible 22, which is also supported by dark vision. It has no special damage resistances or immunities, but it cannot be knocked prone. Makes sense for a creature that is permanently hovering. On languages, it has Deep Speech, the language of the Far Realm, and Undercommon, the language of the Underdark. Most of the time I would rule that a Beholder also speaks Common, depending on where in your setting they are. Whatever kind of encounter you have planned with the Beholder, you're probably going to want them to have a way to communicate with the party, even if that's just to taunt them as they fight. The Beholder has just one trait, and that is its iconic anti-magic cone. Spells, magic items, and other magical effects within a 150-foot cone, which is permanently active, are not going to function. This does also nullify the Beholder's own eye-beam attacks though, so that's something to bear in mind. In D&D 5th edition, even if you use optional flanking rules in combat, creatures do not technically face one direction. They occupy their space and are aware of everything around them. Normally, you can't exactly hit a creature in the back, or you can't avoid its vision by trying to hide and move behind it. At least in combat terms, that creature can still see you or is aware of your presence. The Beholder, however, is a rare exception here. Its anti-magic cone comes from the Beholder's main large eye, so the direction it's facing is actually very important on a battle map. In terms of game design, the anti-magic cone isn't there to trick players like an invisible field to force them to waste their spell slots. A player character should know if the Beholder's main eye is looking at them, and they will then know that they are within the effect of the anti-magic cone. Even though it is effectively always permanently active, the Beholder can choose to close its main eye to nullify the cone when it needs to. A lot of this supplementary information is made clear in the Volo's Guide to Monsters entry. The Beholder then has a basic bite attack, which, let's be honest, as the DM, you're probably never going to use. And then it has its signature eye raise action. It fires off 3 out of 10 of its eye rays at random. An important point to note here though, and this is clarified in Volo's Guide to Monsters, is that the random roll for the eye rays in combat is just there to make things easier to run as the DM, so you don't have to make constant choices during combat when the Beholder's turn comes around. Outside of combat, the Beholder has complete and absolute control over how it uses each of its eye rays. There's no randomness involved. The Beholder will use each of its eye rays as a tool as it sees fit. Using its telekinesis and disintegration rays, for example, it can build, craft, and manipulate its surroundings with ease. There are an array of different effects here from the eye rays, but the ones to watch out for in terms of who you target as the DM are the petrification ray, the disintegration ray, and the death ray. If you roll all 3 of these on the same round, then somebody is probably going to die. With legendary actions, the Beholder can use 3 more eye rays at different points in the initiative order. An interesting point though, it doesn't have any legendary resistances as a legendary creature. So as deadly as the Beholder can be, one save or suck spell like Hypnotic Pattern could take it out of the battle, at least for the duration of the spell. Altogether, this brings the Beholder to a challenge rating of 13 or 14 if it's encountered in its lair. The Beholder in its lair has 3 lair actions. The first of these creates a fairly large area of difficult terrain. The second causes appendages to emerge from a surface to try and grapple hostile creatures. And the third makes an eye appear on a surface which fires a random eye ray. So in the round where this one triggers, the Beholder could be unleashing 7 eye rays in one round of combat. Overall, the Beholder has a great stat block. Just a reminder, if you're enjoying this video so far, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel Nazir North for more monster breakdowns like this in the future. Next, let's spend a bit of time on customization and some of the additional Beholder options presented in Volo's Guide to Monsters. This book has a number of role tables that can help you to create a unique and individual Beholder, covering things like its shape, colour, skin type, mouth and teeth, etc. And most importantly, and much like a player character building out their background, the book contains tables on Beholder personality traits, ideals, bonds and flaws. This can really help you work out what your Beholder is like, how they're going to behave. On mechanical customization, it does give us some options on alternative eye rays you can use as well. This is particularly useful if you are going to run a Beholder against an experienced group of players who may have come up against a Beholder or 2 in the past. Swapping out some of those eye rays for alternative effects will keep the players on their toes. For example, you could swap out the Charm Ray for a Banishment Ray, or the Disintegration Ray for a Ray of Chain Lightning. As diverse and unique as your basic Beholders can be, we are also spoiled for choice with a wide selection of Beholder variants we can use from the official sourcebooks. Sticking first with the monster manual, we have the Death Tyrant. This is effectively a Beholder Lich. Its type is undead, and it takes most things the Beholder is good at and ramps them up to 11. The stat block is fairly similar, but there are some key differences to note. The Death Tyrant has proficiency in all saving throws, so it's going to be highly resistant to spells and other magical effects. And its eye cone is no longer anti-magic, but a cone that prevents healing and turns dead humanoids into zombies. Otherwise, its eye rays and legendary actions are the same, just with a higher DC to resist their effects, so a tougher monster overall. Next up in the monster manual is one of the so-called Beholder kin, the Spectator. For all intents and purposes, this is functionally a diet Beholder that you can throw at players at lower levels. It has just the 4 eye rays and no anti-magic cone, but it does have spell reflection as a reaction, which allows it to potentially bounce a spell off itself and hit someone else. The actual Beholder doesn't have anything to do with its reaction, so if you wanted a really tough Beholder fight, I would seriously consider giving them this reaction option as well. It's pretty great. Last one to mention from the monster manual is the Beholder Zombie. This is a very weak undead beholder, probably one that is in service to a lich or a necromancer. Its mental ability scores are massively reduced, so this is just a husk of a beholder serving someone else. This one isn't going to have retained any of the telltale personality traits of a beholder. It is just a mindless minion. As with the Spectator, this one is a fairly low challenge rating, so it's a good one to throw at lower level parties, just to give them some beholder flavour before they're ready to fight the real thing. Volo's Guide to Monsters then introduces 3 additional types of beholder kin. We have the Death Kiss, a pale vampiric beholder that is unique in that it doesn't have any eye rays at all. We have the Gorth, another unique variant that is somewhere between the Spectator and the regular beholder in terms of power. Then finally we have the Gazer, a tiny low CR beholder type with a handful of fairly weak eye rays. Okay, let's move on to allies and minions, not counting the beholder kin we've already covered. Whatever environment they are operating in, the beholder is almost certainly at the top of the food chain, and it's probably the only beholder around. It may have even killed a number of other beholders or powerful creatures in order to establish and maintain its power base. A beholder will not just have one type of minion, but will have an entire ecosystem of other creatures in its service. Let's break down a beholder's minions and followers into a few categories. First off is the grunts. These are going to be a relatively intelligent, probably humanoid species that supports the beholder in large numbers, and they probably live inside or close to the beholder's lair. Examples here could include things like kobolds, orcs, some variety of goblins such as hobgoblins or bugbears, or maybe even drow or dweogar. As we know, the beholders speak Undercommon, suggesting they may have a preference for establishing their lairs in the Underdark. The grunts have a pretty dangerous job in that they probably have the highest mortality rate of all the minion types. They are the cannon fodder to throw at an approaching threat to bog them down. Nobody is going to miss them when they die. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if grunts are killed accidentally by the beholder's own traps in the lair now and then, and the beholder probably wouldn't even blink an eye. Next you will have the enforcers. These are going to be tougher monsters that are fewer in number and probably deeper into the lair, closer to the beholder. You have pretty much free reign as a DM here when selecting enforcers. You may want to choose some other beholder kin, maybe some spectators or something similar, or maybe any other monster which a beholder could have conceivably convinced to join its service. When choosing enforcers, remember what we said earlier about the beholder's lair. It's going to have many routes which are not easily accessible on foot. So perhaps choose enforcers that can fly, burrow or climb, allowing them to move around the lair freely as the beholder does. This means they can patrol around the lair and move from section to section as needed to intercept a threat. Some examples here could include things like cloakers, Etacaps, or the Gibbering Mouther, all of whom have the ability to navigate the lair. Next up are bodyguards. These are the monsters that will fight directly alongside the beholder in combat when the adventuring party finally reaches them. Of all the minions we select here, these are the most important, as you want to choose creatures that have skills and abilities that complement the beholder. Slard work well here, not only as aberrations which fit the theme of a beholder, but they're also relatively tanky creatures which can distract adventurers on the ground, while the beholder is then free to fly around and rain down its eye ray attacks. As the beholder has no legendary resistances, a spellcasting ally with spells like Lesser Restoration may also be helpful to have on hand, as well as a caster with access to counterspell, because that's always going to come in handy. Whatever bodyguards you go with in this final beholder encounter, you may also want to sprinkle in some smaller, more mobile creatures here too, mainly to pin down any adventurers with strong ranged attacks like a ranger or a warlock. cockatrice or harpies could serve that function quite well. Another monster type you may want to scatter throughout the beholder's lair are creatures that I would call hazards. Not necessarily in service to the beholder, but they are kept around because of how they can help to defend the lair. Here I am talking about monsters with lower intelligence and often beast-like creatures. Things like the bullet, ankegs, and oozes all work quite well in this niche. Their intelligence is low enough that they aren't truly aligned to the beholder, but they are sort of placed in the way of the adventuring party, almost like a trap in their own right. Finally, and these are particularly important for beholders, are the informants. They act as the eyes and ears of the beholder outside of the lair. They act like scouts and spies. These could be a humanoid race, maybe drow if the lair is in the Underdark, or maybe some kind of flying creature with good perception or stealth scores. Perhaps, for example, the beholder has some demonic allies, and you could use quasits or even Vroks to fulfill this role. Volo's Guide to Monsters also gives some good suggestions for minions in the beholder section, although I find the groupings in that book less useful. It simply gives 3 minion types: lesser minions, greater minions, and pets, without much distinction on what the roles each of these groups perform. Despite the beholder's tyrannical rule and rampant paranoia, being a minion to a beholder might not be the worst gig you can get. Sure, one day the beholder may decide that you are plotting to betray them and then turn you into a statue, but if you can live with that risk, you could do alright. Beholders are known to send their minions out into the world to loot and pillage and to bring back that loot to the beholder. The beholder then takes its pick of what it wants from the horde and lets the minions divide up what's left. Some may view that as generosity on the part of the beholder, although it's more likely just disinterest in the less valuable items. Either way, a minion could get quite rich from working for a beholder. Okay, so by this point you've got a good idea of what the beholder can do, what its lair is going to be like, and the types of creatures that are going to be fighting alongside it. So now let's get to battle tactics. But remember, first of all, diplomacy is possible when it comes to encountering a beholder. We know from the examples of eye-tyrant beholders that they can cooperate and make deals with other creatures to a certain extent at least. The best route to a diplomatic outcome is going to be through flattery, gifts, and acting as though humbled in the presence of the great and mighty beholder. Any show of strength or power by a player character is likely to be interpreted by the beholder as a challenge and a threat to be eliminated. Beholders also consider their greatest enemies to be other powerful beholders, so visitors offering to help it take down a rival beholder may be welcomed. But even after attempting the peaceful route, combat may break out. So, how will the beholder behave in the fight? The beholder is slow, but it can fly and hover. So it's going to choose to spend pretty much all of its time very high up in the air. When building its lair, it will make sure that rooms where it knows it's going to fight will have very high ceilings. The beholder can be up to 120 feet above the party and still function effectively, as this is the range of its eye rays. The lair is also likely to be in pitch darkness, with all of the beholder's minions and the beholder themselves having dark vision. The beholder's dark vision range is also 120 feet. This is quite long considering most player characters with dark vision will only have a 60-foot range with it. This means that the beholder can lurk in a dark corner of the room out of sight, launching eye rays at the party, and it may be untargetable during most of that time. The lair will also feature large forms of cover enough to hide the beholder's body, perhaps stone columns that reach from floor to ceiling or stalactites, which the beholder can position itself behind. Most traps in the lair will also be floor-based, as there is no risk of the hovering beholder triggering them accidentally by itself. If the beholder positions itself near the ceiling or a high wall, it's probably going to remain within 30 or 40 feet, so within its dashing distance, of one of the many tunnels it has throughout the lair, allowing it to move into a different chamber should it need to. These tunnels will of course be high off the ground, not easy to access for those on the floor. Realistically, in combat, the Beholder is never going to waste its action on a bite attack, even if a foe has closed into melee range with it. It's going to want to use its eye rays as often as it can. The bite is only really going to come into play as an opportunity attack if a creature leaves its range. When it comes to eye ray targeting, Beholders are smart creatures, so they may decide to focus fire many eye rays in one round on what they consider to be high danger targets. Maybe the party's healer or their ranged damage dealer. Beholder is also likely to shout out during battle to command its minions to act strategically, perhaps commanding them to block certain passageways or to target certain foes. A very mean Beholder, and by that I of course mean a very mean DM, may even command some of its minions to smash petrified party members to pieces, preventing them from being restored or healed. Despite the Beholder's powerful eye rays, flight, and deadly lairs and minions protecting them, one of its most powerful abilities is still its anti-magic cone. The Beholder will quickly work out in combat, if it didn't already know, which enemy spellcasters are most dangerous, and it will use its cone to focus on them. Even though its own eye rays don't work within the anti-magic cone, it could lift up a heavy object with its telekinesis and drop it from just above the cone to land on an enemy. Even though the rocks or heavy objects, whatever they are, lose their magic, gravity will still do the work. Whether the Beholder will retreat or not, assuming the party start to win the fight, will depend on the personality of the individual Beholder. As we discussed earlier, the Beholder you create may be so confident in its greatness that defeat seems completely impossible right up to the point of its death. Alternatively, your Beholder may weave in and out of different chambers in the lair as the adventurers progress, joining combat with its minions here and there, firing off a few eye rays and then flying away through a different tunnel or tube to another part of the lair, essentially just toying with the party, harassing them as they move. But equally, you could have a cold and calculating Beholder who is smart enough to know when they are outmatched, seeking a swift retreat if their hit points fall below, say, 1/4 of their max. If you've got any stories about Beholder encounters, either as a player or DM, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear them. I really hope you've all learned something about Beholders from this video. I certainly did as I was reading through the entries to make the video. If you've enjoyed, please remember, like the video and subscribe to the channel Nazir North for more monster breakdowns and other D&D content in the future. Cheers everyone, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.